of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University. And for those of you who've been following us, we've been doing these book talks ever since the COVID pandemic started. But now we took some pause and break in that, and we're back now with our CICW summer book talks. The first talk we're doing today is with Dr. Sophia Arjana, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Western Kentucky University. So welcome, Dr. Arjana.
Thank you.
We also have two forthcoming talks, which you can find also on our website, which is www.contemporaryislam.org. The book that we have in front of us today is book Buying Buddha, Selling Rumi, Orientalism and the Mystic Marketplace, which is, to my knowledge, the fourth book that Dr. Arjana had published. She has three other books that she had published previously, and I know that she's also working on the next one, which hopefully will be out next year. But this book that came out last year has been really interesting, I think, to me and many people for many reasons, because it resonates with much of what is going on in contemporary society, regard to religion, to how religion is commodified, and how, especially in the West, what is often understood as Eastern spirituality or Eastern religions are in many ways adopted and adapted in Western popular discourse, but not without modification. And these modifications of these Eastern traditions really speak to larger issues related to capitalist society, to colonialism, to modernity, to the study of religion and the way how religion is understood in the West. And I have to say, this book is something I personally had been thinking about for quite some time. And I finally found someone who actually expressed it so well and wrote so well about it. And Dr. Arjana did a fabulous job. So I would recommend everybody to, even after listening this book talk, to purchase the book, because the book is so rich. There is only that much we can do in our brief conversation here. So Dr. Arjana, once again, welcome. And I will start by asking you the question that I ask of every author, and that is, why did you write the book, and what is its main argument?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be with you today. Well, the book actually kind of started because of a course I took in graduate school many years ago. And one of the books we read in that course was Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. And one of the things that he talks about is these kind of distinctions between pre-modernity and modernity. And so one of the things that he argues is that among, those changes in modernity is this kind of loss of enchantment, right? So in kind of the old world, there were, demons and angels and magic. And then in a new world, there's less of that, right? And there's really this world that's guided by science and technology, right? And freedom of choice. And so one of the questions I was left with was what about those individuals who are seeking enchantment, right? And who really want to live in some kind of enchanted state or enchanted world. And so this is one of the questions I try to answer in the book. But I was very interested in this idea of us all living in an age of disenchantment, right? This is like the age of, cell phones and like endless technology and kind of endless pressures because of things like capitalism, right? There's a number of arguments I make in the book, and I'll just kind of outline three of them. One of them is this idea that when somebody says they're being spiritual or engaging in mysticism, what they're often doing is practicing other religions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, but they're not really naming them as religions. They're like, I'm on this mystical path, or I'm a spiritual person. And so there is a process of colonization, right, that's going on when people do that. And, largely that's kind of white affluent or middle class or upper middle class white folks that are doing that, but not exclusively, but largely. Another thing that I argue is that Orientalism is a dominant force in the marketplace that offers products whose appeal is often based on a perceived difference or exoticism, right? And these products are sometimes blurred. And so you'll have a product which may have symbols or images from, from Hinduism or from Buddhism or from Islam, and they're kind of all thrown in together. And this is the idea that I present, which I call muddled Orientalism, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later. And then another, idea in this book that I think is important is this idea that modern mysticism offers a temporary escape, right, from modernity and its pressures. And this, I think, makes it appealing. And so one of the things I tried to do in the book is to talk about, the different products and different kind of therapies and different, things like mystical tourism that offer these temporary escapes. In the last chapter, I actually talk about entertainment, right? So television and film and things which are kind of escapist. But those are three of the kind of main arguments in the book. There's others, but those are kind of three that are interesting to talk about.
Yes, thank you so much for summarizing it for us and our viewers. It is really, I think, striking to see how appropriated these symbols of Eastern religions, Orientalism, and all of that had been introduced, appropriated into the mainstream Western experience today through the practice of yoga, mindfulness, popular preachers of all religions, TV shows, and we're going to talk about some of this later. But I want to ask you this question. In the book, and you start this very early in the book, you critique what you call a kind of dilettantism. That is to say, the focus on spirituality and mysticism among many in the West, oftentimes expressed as, spiritual without being religious and things like that, and which, of course, spirituality and religiosity comes in all variety and forms, and people, of course, have full right to choose their own path. But sometimes the way in which this is expressed, and you talk a lot about this in your book, does fall and does morph into some sort of dilettantism. So how is this dilettantism manifested?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the things I talk about is how the search for enchantment in the modern world is often characterized by this. And I mean, some of this has to do with, the capitalism, right? And all these offerings that are made for the consumers. So, somebody can have a very quick escape from their life and kind of be led to believe that this is going to be transformative, when we know from studying, as you and I are religious scholars, we know from studying religious traditions that the mystical path is like a lifelong project, right? Or lifelong endeavor. And so some of the ways we see this is, something like, a meditation retreat for a weekend, or, there's a lot of examples in mystical tourism where you have people that are drawn to places like Turkey or India or Morocco in search of a transformative experience. And these are kind of like these quick fixes for the ailments that affect us, right? Which may be physical, spiritual, kind of mental health issues. There's a variety of mystical products and experiences that kind of, make these promises, right? Now, one of the things that scholars talk about is this thing called Immediatism, which is the idea that you'll immediately, like instantaneously, kind of have this transformative change in your life. And one of the reasons the East is, such an appeal that way is because the East, because of Orientalism, has long been viewed as like the source of power, or the source of kind of like knowledge, or, mystical experience. And so then you have these products which are tied to that, right, and are promising that. And there's, a number of problems with that. And one of the ideas I explored in the book that is something that is voiced by a philosopher named Zygmunt Bauman, is this idea of liquid modernity. And one of the things which he has this wonderful book about, and one of the things that he writes about is how, because of the marketplace and because of people's need for kind of consumption, there's kind of an endless consumption of these different efforts to be satisfied, but they're never satisfactory. So people like keep on doing these things, right? They keep on buying these products. They keep on going on these trips. They keep on doing these yoga retreats or these meditation retreats where they think that, within, 48 hours, they're going to have these, these transformative changes. And so I think that's one, his work is one of the kind of useful ways we can think about this, which is that one of the ways the marketplace kind of functions is as a place where, consumers are endlessly buying new products, trying new things, but they're never satisfied. And that's one of the things that he talks about in his work.
Yes, and it is really, I like the term that you use, immediatism. Is that what you mentioned?
Yeah. Not my term, by the way. Other scholars coin that term, but it's a term that I talk about in the book.
Yeah, it's the instant gratification, right? It is perfect, actually, for the consumerist society in which we live. And when I say consumerist society, I don't mean here only in the United States or in the West. I mean, you've traveled the world, you've been to different countries, and you've seen how also in so many different countries of the world, consumerism is just rampant, and everything is consumed, including religion.
Right.
Obviously. I would like to ask you, so from a religious historian or a scholar's point of view, can you give us a brief breakdown of how the term mysticism emerged in the study of religion? Because you write quite a bit about that in the book. And how is it tied to colonialism and capitalism?
Right. That's a great question. And I do want to kind of give credit here to scholars like Richard King, who've really done, incredible work on the genealogy of mysticism, and recommend his book on mysticism in India, and Orientalism in India, where he has an entire chapter that kind of gives this genealogy. But mysticism has a genealogy or history that's like very deeply embedded in colonialism and religious studies. And scholars, as I mentioned, including Richard King, have written extensively about these intersections in great detail. So one of the things that we find with the idea of mysticism is it's a concept that is essentially invented in the West, right? And in the Western Academy. And so one of the things that we find is that when scholars, especially early scholars, write about mysticism, what they're really writing about are kind of Christian concepts, right? And then they try to kind of fit every other religious kind of thing that they think is mysticism into that. And so, for example, the idea of the spiritual self reflects personal theology. The union with the divine is another way of expressing the logos. And the idea of Western mysticism is tied to Christian thought, right? But it's often imposed on other religions. And so we know that scholars, we know that they made these efforts with Sufism, right? Early scholars of Sufism or of Islam or of religion would make these efforts, which I document in my book, and other scholars have documented, of erasing Islam from Sufism. Sufism has nothing to do with Islam. Sufism is like this universalistic kind of thing. And they try what they have done, what religious scholars have done with those kinds of moves is to kind of disconnect, right, these traditions from their original sources, and then make them kind of these universalistic traditions, which is something that's very colonialist, obviously, right? So, and we know there's a history of that in the academy. And so one of the things that's going on here is that when scholars erase or disconnect a religious tradition from, right, some kind of conceived form of mysticism, they make it more palatable to a white audience, right, to European or American scholars or consumers. Because, a lot of people are not going to be comfortable saying, I am Hindu or I am Muslim, but they may be comfortable saying, I'm spiritual and I have this like thing in this altar in my house and whatever, and I consider myself a mystic, right? But they're not going to feel comfortable with making like a religious proclamation, right? And so there's a piece of this kind of thing with mysticism, both in the academy, but also, also just by, consumers that has to do with that kind of palatability. Now, there's another thing about this, which scholars of religion have written about, which is that historically mysticism was constructed, right, as a category of knowledge at times to help kind of explain other traditions that didn't look like Protestant notions of what a correct or orthodox religion would look like, right? And so we know this from like the work of, one of the greatest religious scholars ever, J.C. Smith, right? That this is one of the things that has taken place, right? Is this effort to fit things into Protestant notions of what a correct religion is. And, if it didn't fit, then it kind of got this different, right, like definition. But of course, some of the times they got it wrong. And, one of the things that we see if we look at the history of religious studies, right, is if there was like a period where there was a focus on texts, and we see this a lot with religious studies, this over focusing on text because the text is so important in the Reformation and so important in, Protestant Christianity. Then what we see is an over focus on texts, in the study of religion. And there's been a lot of work done on this, right? Not by me, but by other scholars. And there's a great article, which I often use with, teach to my students, which is about this problem in the study of Buddhism, right? Where, early scholars just focused so much on the text that they kind of ignored, right, was actually what Buddhists were actually doing, right? And so it's these kinds of things, these kinds of histories, right, that we're talking about when we talk about the history of mysticism. It's a constructed category. It's a category of knowledge that is meant to help to explain religions or traditions, which, sometimes scholars were having trouble grappling with. And I think one of the key things is that mysticism is something that is a very colonial idea in the sense that then all these other things are kind of re-articulated to fit into it. And then we see these kind of bizarre explanations of Sufism, right, by scholars. Oh, Sufism isn't, part of Islam. Sufism is actually part of Christianity, or it's part of, it's part of like this universalistic tradition. So this is kind of, part of the history that, that we need to think about when we think about the construction of mysticism.
Yeah, and it sounds to me as if many of these individuals who are involved in these type of activities really end up emptying out the content, a lot of content from many of these religious traditions. If we were to put it in Islamic terms, they take the aqidah out, the belief systems out. Some ethical precepts are maintained, and a lot of praxis, which Muslims in general understand to be one of the cornerstones of their own religious experience, are also emptied out, so that a lot of religious tradition is simply emptied out, is simply erased and deleted in this process of appropriation through this understanding of mysticism. Right. But I think it also sort of fits well with the age that we're in, this really extreme personal subjectivities that we're talking about. So that people, it's all about personal experience, and this has to work for me, and this is my truth. Mm-hmm. As opposed to the way in which these great traditions that you talk about, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, have traditionally, through history, ages, millennia, understood their own path to be much more than just personal experience and subjectivity and so on. So that is often sort of emptied out and deleted from the conversation. But I want to expand on something that you just mentioned, and you have, I think, a whole chapter on it in your book. You talk about cultural colonialism and muddled Orientalism. Can you explain these two concepts, cultural colonialism, muddled Orientalism, why they are so important in understanding these phenomena?
Sure. So, to begin with cultural colonialism is seen in the ways that spiritual shoppers, who are these individuals that kind of we find as active consumers, right, of a lot of these products I talk about in the book, like re-articulate these traditions, kind of recreate these traditions. And I have this particular definition that I put in my book, which is that cultural colonialism is defined as borrowing, adopting, or stealing another person's culture, religion, or tradition without giving credit to that tradition or being part of that tradition or identifying with that tradition, right? And so there's an element of this that we see, for example, in fashion, where these are kind of real obvious examples of cultural colonialism, where we see like the depiction of Rama on designer bikinis, right, is one example I talk about in the book, and footwear with a symbol, right? And so these are examples where obviously the designer's not, Hindu or Buddhist or whatever, and they're making money off of it. Now, cultural colonialism is also seen in the marking of mysticism, right? And I have this whole part of the book where I talk about Mysticism Inc. or Mysticism Incorporated, right? And this represents this seemingly endless kind of choice of products and therapies and kind of experiences tied to the quest for spiritual growth through an engagement, right, with these religious traditions of what I mostly focus on is Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. But many of these products are connected to models of therapeutic wellness, and they're like marketed in such a way that they're kind of reimagined, right, as a kind of therapeutic tool, as opposed to kind of the way they would be situated in their original religion, right? So that's one kind of way we can think about cultural colonialism. And I'm not an ethicist, right? So I didn't feel comfortable kind of making like major prescriptions about like what is okay and what's not okay. But one of the things that I did try to talk about in my book is that, when people steal other people's religions, it's harmful, right? Or when they kind of re-articulate the religion in a way that is obviously not that religion or culture anymore, it's harmful. But there's also, an aspect of colonialism here, which is important because a lot of the people that make money off of mystical products are not like, first of all, are not like Hindu, Buddhist, or Muslim. They're also like not from those cultures. And so whiteness is something that I, as a white scholar and as a convert to Islam, like I always try to be very conscious about that in my work. And I really try to be conscious about that here to say that, this is a problem, right? And this is something that we see, and we see it in things like Goop, right? Gwyneth Paltrow's, company, which is now this huge corporation. And here we have, people making money off of, right, products which are essentially coming from these religious traditions, but kind of reimagined as these, therapeutic systems or therapeutic.
And which are often sacred in other people's traditions too. And that sacredness is often stripped off in that process or stripped away, right?
Yes, right. And there's a couple places where I'm not like a scholar of these other traditions, right? I was trained as a comparativist, but I don't consider myself a scholar of like obviously African religions or African American religions. But there's a couple places in my book where I also talk about that, right? About the colonization of Native American culture. That's a huge one. I'm from the Southwest, so like that's something that like I'm pretty aware of, and also obviously African American traditions is also another thing that African American culture is also colonized, all the time, right? Yeah. So in terms of Orientalism, there's kind of different ways we can think about Orientalism and muddled Orientalism. And so in my first book, what I did was I focused on kind of the scariest side of Orientalism, which are these, in that book, I looked at these imaginary Muslim monsters in the West, starting kind of with the early centuries of Islam to the present. And there's those kind of very scary, aspects of Orientalism, those frightening kind of fantasies. But then there's this whole kind of thing where the East is seen as, the Orient is seen as this place of kind of mystical power and spiritual renewal, right? And what we find in Orientalism is, a kind of appeal and attraction to those ideas. And those ideas are very Orientalist ideas. I mean, there were very famous Orientalists that would say, when they were kind of, pulling into some port in the Orient, they were like meeting their bride, or they were like about to, attain all this knowledge and, spiritual power. So these ideas are old, right? Now, one of the things I tried to kind of talk about with the mystical marketplace is this concept of muddled Orientalism. And what that is when you have a lack of distinction, right? This is one of the things that happens when religions are colonized. People just kind of throw everything in, like in a bucket, and try to make products appealing. And so we see this quite a bit. We see this where there's images of or symbols from these different traditions that are all in like one product or one product line. And then another thing that we see is in this whole area of mystical tourism, is what I call it, which is a future book project for me, that actually want to write a whole book on mystical tourism. But in mystical tourism, we have this kind of business of selling enchantment as a vacation, right? And so what we see there in places like Bali and India are resorts and kind of places where people can go to and they can experience all these kind of different aspects of the Orient, right? So mindfulness exercises, Ayurvedic cuisine, Sufi retreats, Rumi readings, and they're all kind of, but that's one of the things about Orientalism is sometimes it's very sloppy, right? And that's where this term muddled Orientalism comes into, because what that's about is just trying to make things appealing for consumers without any kind of concern about like what is accurate. Right?
Yeah. And well, the thing that comes to my mind, and you write about this in your book, is, of course, when you talk about this mystical tourism, and especially by people from the West going to Bali, to Morocco, to different places, whether they be yoga retreats or, some kind of Buddhist retreats or Sufi retreats. The best example I can think of, and like I said, you write in the book about it, is Eat, Pray, Love, right, by Elizabeth Gilbert. I mean, it is just a perfect example of it. So can you tell us a little bit about that and its place in this popular culture and how it is manifested that way?
Right. Absolutely. So this is this kind of idea of, like white mysticism kind of thing, right? So, religion is commodified in the modern world in like numerous ways. And I mean, there's always been religious commodities like through history, right? So we have historically with the pilgrimages in Europe, we have like pilgrims badges and these various items that people would buy or whatever. But my book is mostly interested in the way that religion is marketed as mysticism or spirituality and what that involves. So in other words, like how does this marking reflect white privilege, right? And colonialism and even white supremacy. And when we can understand white mysticism is a practice that dominates and colonizes a religion and its associated cultures, while erasing its origins and practitioners, right? And so there's a lot of examples in my book. And one of the things that kind of comes up with the Eat, Pray, Love book, and there's a whole kind of genre of stuff like that, where, somebody who is like an unhappy, affluent white person goes to these different countries or goes to a different place, right? And they are able to kind of heal themselves. One of the ideas I talk about in the book related to that is the idea of the mystic poor, right? And that's the idea that, consumers from Europe or the US go to someplace like Bali or go to someplace else like India or Morocco, and they find kind of enlightenment or they find some kind of spiritual growth by interacting with the poor who are naturally mystical, right? And this is really a problematic idea, like for numerous reasons, but one of them is the idea that, the bodies of, colonized and formerly colonized people and the bodies of people who are not white are somehow like envisioned as like these sources of power, right? And so this is something that comes up with Eat, Pray, Love, right? And there's a whole kind of section in that book, which I quote in my book about, the author kind of observing this person who is laboring, right, cleaning, and how that was somehow some kind of, source of spiritual enlightenment for her, right? And so
as long as somebody else does all of that, right? As long as somebody else is poor, as long as the poverty is embodied in someone else's, body and
exactly. But that idea of the like primitive or the native, like somehow like healing the white person, like that's a very old problematic idea. And one of the reasons it's problematic is because it has to do with kind of the sensuality of like other people, the perceived sensuality and the perceived kind of power of other people, right? And there's a number of other, kind of ways that's problematic. So, one of the other examples I talk about are these kind of expatriates who live in Bali, and they, these are expatriate women. A lot of them are from Europe, some from North America, and they have almost like a costume that they wear, right? Which is this, particular clothing that they wear to kind of symbolize that they're, spiritual and they're doing kind of mystical stuff in Bali, right? And so even the clothing they wear is kind of indicating that they're on some kind of spiritual path. But of course, they're also there because, they can afford to be there and have people do work for them, right? Yes. So there's these people that go to Bali and they're like do yoga all the time, but they hire, people to do their cleaning, cooking, driving, that kind of thing, right? So there's a whole kind of process of colonialism or lifestyle of colonialism that's often wrapped up, especially in mystical tourism, but also more broadly in this kind of white mysticism, right? Which is problematic for many reasons, as we know.
Yes, of course. And you're mentioning Bali, and of course you've spent quite a bit of time in Indonesia. You're familiar with the country and how it works in different regions. What was also interesting to me, and one of the markets in Jakarta when I was there several years ago, and for some reason, I now, the name of the market is escaping me, but that market where you have a lot of these handcrafts and it's just like stalls and small shops where they sell all the handcrafts and so on. 99% of them sell Buddhist stuff, even though almost all the sellers are Muslims. I think I've only seen 1 or 2 stalls that sell anything Islamic or any kind of Muslim calligraphy or any symbols. And it is very clear that they're catering to Western tourists, right? They are catering, and in some ways they are also incorporating or appropriating that view of themselves as being in some ways custodians of that kind of culture, so that white mysticism becomes imposed in some ways on people in countries like Indonesia, and they find that it's very marketable, religion is commodified, so it becomes almost a way of life, an industry over there to supply all of these experiences, workers who are going to, clean and drive all these white expats who come to places like Indonesia and many other places, and who provide all these clothing and other materials that people are going to take back home and display in their homes in order to show that they are spiritual but not religious, right?
Right.
So
yeah, I think that's an excellent example. And another thing I've seen in Indonesia are dream catchers. So especially at Borobudur, they have, if you go walk through the market, as you say, there's these Buddhist products because it's, a huge Buddhist site, but there's also Native American dream catchers. That's kind of an international product that's become kind of a transnational, international product where like any place there's a religious site, there'll be these dream catchers. Like as if a Native American dream catcher is somehow Indonesian, right? It's obviously not, but it's like, I've seen those there. And I've also seen them all over Bali, especially in Ubud, which is, this kind of artist kind of colony tour. Well, it's a tourist place now, but used to be more of an artist colony. You can see, I have actually pictures of dream catchers in a lot of store windows there, right? Because it's just looked at as like this mystical kind of for everybody thing, right? It's pretty bizarre.
And it's also interesting how everyday items that people would use in countries like Indonesia assume mystical importance in many of these white mystics, so to say, who travel to these areas, so that people often wouldn't even pay attention to many of those artifacts in their own environment, but would somehow, just because they are in that environment, they assume almost mythical proportions. Right. in that Western experience of that space and place.
Right.
Yeah, wonderful. So I want to turn our conversation now to Islam with whatever time we have left.
Okay.
You talk about Islam quite a bit in your book. So let's talk first about the Rumi maniacs, as you call them. So quite a bit has been written now about separating Rumi and his teachings and poetry from Islam. I think Omid Safi and many others have written about it. Tell us a bit more about this phenomenon and the way you write about it in your book.
Right. Well, Rumi maniacs, I want to say, and this is something, I mean, this work is quoted and cited in my book, but it's a term taken from this great book called Contemporary Sufism, Piety, Politics, and Popular Culture, where the authors, it's co-authored by 3 different scholars, where they talk about Rumi mania, and that's where I got the, that's where I got the term. And so I just wanted to give credit there. First of all, to say, before we talk about Rumi specifically, more broadly, the marketing mysticism involves this translation project, right? Where things are retranslated, as I said. And sometimes there's a complete erasure of, teachings and texts and rituals. And so we see this, for example, with fads like Buddhist chic, which is like this kind of Buddhist style of dressing, if you're a yoga, like if you're big on yoga, and you see this in places like Boulder and probably places like Santa Cruz, California, right? There's this kind of style. Now, in the case of Rumi, it's really interesting, right? Because Rumi is a Muslim poet, was a Muslim poet who is certainly very religious and devout. So anybody that's done just even a surface reading of Rumi knows that Rumi is somebody who is a very devout and very religious, individual. But Rumi has been reimagined as this kind of new age, universalistic spiritual teacher. And we see how, Rumi is popularized and how Islam is erased. So like his deep love for Allah, for God, is then like reimagined as some kind of romantic love. Right. Now, one of the other things we see with Rumi is we see Rumi make huge there's a lot of appearances of Rumi on social media. And this actually has to do with muddled Orientalism as well, which is that we see kind of, if you look at like Twitter or you're on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, there'll be these Rumi quotes, but I think Omid Safi calls them fake Rumi, right? And so one of the things is that a lot of these quotes aren't from Rumi, right? Another thing that actually happens is that Rumi and the Buddha, their quotes will be exchanged, right? Where like the Buddha, like maybe you may or may not have said something, but something attributed to him. And then like it appears on a Rumi meme or a Rumi kind of Instagram post, right? And that has to do with muddled Orientalism, kind of this kind of sloppiness of it, but the other thing that has happened is that, Rumi obviously is mostly read in North America and Europe in English, or right, maybe another language that's not Persian. And some of the most popular translations of Rumi were done by, people who actually don't read Persian, and they have just kind of had these kind of inspirational moments where they're like, I think this is what the poem means, right? And then this kind of becomes the poem. Right, this becomes the poem. So, Rumi's become this kind of brand. Rumi's like this global popular figure who many people don't even know as Muslim. So, like, if you go,
don't know who he is.
Yeah, they don't know who he is. They wouldn't know he was born in like Balkh, Afghanistan, right? And was Persian speaking, and like had this, like the life that he had, and don't know that his tomb is in Konya, right? Turkey. Like they don't know these things, right? And so sometimes I've had these moments a few times in my teaching career where Rumi will come up and I'll say something about him being Muslim, and students will be like, what? It doesn't register, right? And so this is what happens when religions are colonized, right? And when religious figures are colonized, is that the religious kind of history, right, of that person or their identity becomes erased, and they become something else. And so Rumi, is a really good example of that, is an excellent example of that. And people are just, there's these Rumi reading groups and Rumi this and Rumi that. And there's also a lot of kind of, Rumi, like there's a great restaurant in Atlanta. We like drive from Bowling Green. My family will drive from Bowling Green, Kentucky to Atlanta every once in a while and spend the week at Atlanta to eat at, right? Which is this restaurant that's named after Rumi, which is really good Persian food, right? So it's also, a marketing thing. Like he's recognizable enough as a name that people will be like, oh, I recognize that name. Let's go to this restaurant, without knowing that he's a Muslim poet.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, interesting how sometimes people would find whatever they think it's a wise saying or statement, and they would just attach name Rumi to it, because as if somehow it's going to gain more currency, and that whole fake Rumi phenomenon and so on. But I also like those memes when people say like, whatever Rumi said, it wasn't about your girlfriend or something like that, which is what you just mentioned about people sort of translating what was Rumi's love for God and quest for God into some sort of romantic quest, and they think he is writing to another person, or he's writing to his lover, and he is, but his lover is not human, right? So it's a totally different concept here. And so I think it is important to understand that. And I think Safi and you and many others have written about it and have shown how important it is to recognize that Rumi was a devout Muslim, and somebody who was devout, practicing Muslim with everything that entails. And of course, he was on this, whatever you want to call it, mystical journey or path, but that is not unique to Rumi in Muslim history. So many Muslims and obviously people in other faiths have also done similar quests, as part of their devotional practices. And I also like what you mentioned earlier about religion being really a lifelong commitment and a journey that you go on, not something that you can get instant gratification with. You go on a weekend retreat, and of course retreats could be important, and sometimes spending time in such an intense environment can help people intensify their spiritual feelings, but it's not something that is just meant to be for just one weekend only, of course. And I like how you have weaved this in your presentation, all of these different threads about this. So if we could move from Rumi to commodification of Islam in general. So how is commodification of Islam manifested? You write in book, for instance, about Hamza Yusuf and, Agim, or, Abang A, as it's known sometimes in Indonesia, who are good examples of that. So can you tell us more about this?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things about modernity is that even religious teachers and people that are, very devout, including those situated in the Islamic tradition, also have to market themselves to an audience, right, which is kind of used to a particular language. So one of the things that I kind of point out in the book is that we have with some of these people, and Yusuf is one example that I point to. I'm not arguing that he's not religious, right? I'm not making a critique about that. But what I am saying is that there's a use of particular words, like kind of code words, right, that consumers recognize, like spiritual over religious, for example. And this is part of the kind of need to market to religious consumers who utilize that language, right, and find that language appealing. Now, this is part of what we call the power of the marketplace. And another example that I could kind of bring in, which is useful, is there's this really great book called Brand Halal, by Faige Shirazi, I think is the author's name. And what that book is about are, religious products, Islamic religious products, which kind of run the gamut from halal makeup to halal toys, right? And one of the kind of
called halalization of Islam, right?
Right, exactly. And so that's a wonderful, brilliant book, which I love. And one of the things that that scholar, that the author, writes about, is how brand halal is a really useful way to think about religion and commodification, because it illustrates how products can symbolize or kind of introduce the idea of piety. So by buying this product, or by, having a particular way that you're dressing, or a particular way that you're speaking, or your mannerisms, that indicates piety, right? And so that's something that we also see in some of these religious teachers, right? Is that there's this kind of whole performance of Islam, right? There's this whole kind of performance of Islam that appeals to their followers and appeals to, people that are interested in listening to the messaging by these people. And I'm not, critiquing these people and their contributions, right? Because I think that there's a lot of good there. But what I'm saying is that there's also marketing happening, right? And how unconscious or conscious that is, I don't know. I don't actually know Hamza Yusuf, but you can see it in kind of some of the language that's used. You can see it in some of the, if you kind of study the performances of some of these religious Islamic preachers, you can see this, right? And this has to do, with, what is the consumer audience, and what are they, where are they interested in consuming and purchasing, right? And there's certain things that they're interested in consuming and purchasing. And by the way, this is not just in Islam. And so one of the things that I discuss in my book as well is the prosperity gospel people, like Joel Osteen. If you go to,
I was just going to mention.
Yeah, if you go to his website, check out his products. They're very new agey, right? And they're very kind of part of this spiritual growth, things that say, I don't have the book in front of me, but things that say tote bags and this kind of wood banners that have writing on them with sayings that people put in their office and in their living room that say things like, today is a new day, or whatever. So they're, they're very much about spiritual renewal, right? They're very much about this kind of self-improvement project.
Self-care,
And
mindfulness, all of that. Yeah.
exactly. So, this is something that is not distinctive to Islam and the people that you mentioned. It's something that's, part of the global religious marketplace of appealing to these, notions of, self-improvement, right? And kind of personal, personal enlightenment, right? And we see it like even in the most kind of Joel Osteen is like pretty evangelical, right? But we see it in his products. His website is pretty fascinating. And I've actually had students look at it, and we've had really good discussions about, I teach in Kentucky, so a lot of my students we have a lot of Muslim students because I live in a town that has a lot of Bosnians, but also other immigrants. But most of my students are Christian, and they have found that, very interesting to look at Osteen's, website and the products. And we talk about what does that say about the religious marketplace? Like what messaging is there, So it's pretty interesting stuff.
It is pretty interesting. I would just like to remind our audience who are watching us on YouTube Live that they can submit questions and comments for Dr. Arjana on YouTube Live chat function. And we have about maybe 10-15 minutes left. But before we turn to those questions, and I'm still waiting to see who's going to be the first one to ask a question, I just want to sort of follow up on that. I remember when I first came to the States, I spent quite a few Sunday mornings watching all those. I was fascinated by the fact that you have all these preachers on Sunday mornings on TV. So coming from Europe, it wasn't a common experience to have that. So that was fascinating, number one. Number two, then I discovered that Joel Osteen, I would watch sometimes just his performance. It's very performative. And then later on, as what we could call neo-traditionalism emerged among the Muslims in the United States, I could see very much similarities between Joel Osteen's performative Christianity, if you will, and performative Islam that many of the especially neo-traditionalist Muslim preachers had adopted in the United States. It seems that they are catering to the same type of sociological strata, if you will. Just like all the products that you just mentioned, you have certain type of kufis that people would buy, certain types of, leather-bound, notepads and certain type of pens that they would carry, and certain type of prayer beads that they would wrap around their arm, all to indicate certain type of religiosity, right? So that was what was fascinating to see, is how similar that is across religious traditions, and I think your book captures that really, really well.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And it's, I actually have done this thing in class before where we've watched clips of I did this actually in a gender and Islam class one time, is the example I'm thinking of. And we looked at different clips of, kind of these popular Muslim, figures and their performance styles, right? And so how do they perform Islam, but also how do they perform masculinity? And it's pretty interesting, right, to look at. And the same thing could be done with, these very, popular preachers like Osteen, to watch and kind of observe what their style is like, right? Yeah, performing religion. Religion, right?
And when it switches into different styles of speech, the cadences, and I think he's from Texas, so he has that Texan kind of right. Accent to it, or dialect, or whatever you call it, twang, whatever it is, right. And that also is, I think, part of his charm, part of his, what makes him unique and what makes his presentation quite attractive. It's like watching Matthew McConaughey, except that he's in a huge mega church,
Right, exactly. No, exactly. It's pretty, he's something. He's pretty interesting.
Yeah, he is. And so you do talk at the end of the book about popular culture, TV shows like Lost, the Star Wars, right. The trilogy and beyond. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, since we do have time for that as well.
Sure. So yeah, right. So one of the things that I wanted to try to help people understand through this book was that mysticism is something that we find in a lot of places, right? And the marketplace is bigger than just just the therapies and kind of products, right? Which I talk about in most of the book. And so entertainment is also something, right, where we find these, Orientalist themes and we find mysticism. And so one of the things that was important for me in the book, and I mean, the book is very critical in some ways, right, of these products and experiences. At the same time, one of the things I'm trying to say in my book is that I have sympathy for people trying to find enchantment, right? And I think modernity is hard. And I think it's hard, for a lot of reasons. So modern mysticism offers these paths for relief, right? And for temporary relief from the discomfort, right? And stress and anxiety and kind of exhaustion of modern life. And that's something I write about in my book. And actually in the end, I admit, most times when we go to Indonesia, we go to Bali because there's something about Bali that's very, and my husband's Indonesian. He's not from Bali, he's Javanese, but he lived in Bali for a number of years, and he's usually like, we should go to Bali before we go home, kind of thing. And so there is something about certain places that does provide some kind of relief and does provide, some kind of comfort. And one of the kind of things to think about with entertainment or with all of these, different therapies, is there's this great, great interview with Talal Asad, where the whole interview is kind of about modernity and stuff. And he talks about how we are conscripted into modernity, how we're conscripts of modernity. And then there was this book written kind of based on that idea of that interview called Conscripts and Modernity, which is a great book. But I think that one of the things that my book offers is a way to understand how mysticism gives us a way to negotiate the fact that we're conscripted into modernity. So, in other words, this idea that we are all part of modernity and we all have to deal with it, but there's these different things that are offered, products that are offered to escape. And one of those products is entertainment. And so, I remember when Lost came out, which was a long time ago, I actually rewatched the series again with my family during the pandemic. And it was like really an escape. But the first time I watched it was many years ago when I was living in Albuquerque. And I remember that house. And I remember like going into that room, like every week when it was on and just kind of zoning out, because Lost is very escapist, right? And it was a relief from my life at the time, right? And, I think Star Wars is the same thing. Like you go to the theater and you go see a movie like Star Wars, and you're in this completely different world, which is this kind of fantastic world with all these kind of exotic, incredible things. And it is very escapist. Of course, there's more to it that I write about in the book, which are like the religious themes in Lost in Star Wars, which are like, there's a lot of them. And they're very, I think, prominent, right, in both Lost and the Star Wars films. And so that's another, that's a whole nother probably conversation, but, there's also religion in there, right? And, these kind of mythical journeys are part of these stories very much. And Lost is, got all kinds of themes that are, Hindu and Buddhist and Christian, right down to the main hero's name, right? Christian shepherd, right? Like there's all this stuff. And Star Wars is also, there's this whole thing about the Force. There's, all this Orientalist imagery. There's the idea of the Jedis. Are the Jedis, do they symbolize, a Sufi order, or do they symbolize some kind of, Buddhist, Buddhist
and you have the teacher disciple, sheikh and murid type of relationship, right?
So I try to explore quite a bit of that, in that chapter. And, honestly, there needs to be a lot more work, I think, done on that, because Lucas is somebody who, as I point out in the book, as a young person, had a mystical experience. He's somebody who has read, every Joseph Campbell book. Like, he very much, is a student kind of myth and religion. It's one of the things I mentioned in the book is that an earlier envisioning of the script for Star Wars had even more kind of Muslim-y names in it for places and characters, right? So clearly there's a lot there, right? And that's one of the things I wanted to explore, both the religious elements, but also this idea of the mystical. Like, what is the mystical, theme, or what are the mystical themes in these particular forms of entertainment? I mean, that's part of the appeal of Lost. Lost, I have to say, like, it's held up. My family and I watched it, and I wasn't sure if it would be hokey or kind of weird or something, and they were all just fixated, right, for weeks.
Yeah. I remember also when it first came out, it was fascinating. I think what's fascinating about all these examples, and of course we have Dune that we haven't mentioned as well. Right. It's coming out soon, the new version of the movie and so on, and of course all the novels and whatnot. But I think what is interesting about it is that it's not just entertainment, but it's entertainment that is wrapped in this kind of mystical and environment, if you will. And it is precisely the fact that you can't identify what force is, that you can't identify what these things are, I think, is that adds to the appeal. And it, I think, appeals also to this postmodern religiosity as well, because it's not a specific God, like Abrahamic God and so on, but it is something that can be anything you want it to be, Right. And I think that's precisely what is so appealing about it is, like when people say, if you just do this, the universe will, the universe then assumes godlike properties, if you will. It has its own asma and sifat, that, if we would put it in a Muslim way, its own characteristics and so on. But I would like to switch down. We do have a few questions. So okay. Dr. Imtiaz Yusuf is watching us from Malaysia, and he is asking, in future, and with disenchantment with religions by present youth, even here in Asia, will there be more adherence to spirituality than traditional Islam? How do you view this?
So I think the question is like the kind of growth of new age and alternative, right, stuff in Asia. So that's what a great question. I mean, I love that question. So I think it's maybe a both and answer. So when I was in Indonesia, the last 2 times I was doing field work for this future book, which is late, which I need to write. One of the, things I noticed, especially in Bandung, which is like a kind of the fashion capital of Indonesia, where a lot of clothing is made and there's a lot of kind of fashion stuff, was that there was a lot of like yoga and kind of alternative businesses, right? And I saw a lot of signs for that, right? And so there has been kind of a growth of popularity of some of those things, right? In parts, at least in that part of Southeast Asia. I don't actually know. I've never I have not been to Malaysia. So I don't kind of know what's going on in Malaysia. And so I think that, there's a few examples that I document in my book about that, in India and Indonesia are 2 places where, you've kind of seen, there's a marketing, to try to appeal to those kind of new age products. At the same time, you still have, very kind of traditional kind of religious activities going on and communities going on. So, I think it might be a both and thing, like you're going to see both. But I mean, one of the things about what we call spirituality and mysticism is that, it's always around. And it's been around. But one of the things with modernity is like marketed in all these different ways. And there's all these different, kind of products and stuff. And so we are seeing it, and, kind of grow in popularity. But I don't know that growth and popularity of things like yoga means that there's necessarily like a shift, right? Because I know people that are like deeply religious and devout, and they do, both at the same time, right? So I don't think it necessarily means that. But I think the other part of the question maybe is like, is there a move away from kind of authoritarian models of religion?
Mm-hmm.
And, in some sectors there do seem to be, those moves away where people are like less interested. The youth is less interested in those authority. And we even see this in the US with the whole kind of phenomenon of being unmosqued, where, the mosque doesn't really provide like what, people in their 20s are looking for necessarily. Some of that has to do with language, but some of it has to do with, the messaging, right? And so, there obviously needs to be some alternatives in messaging, and not exclusively, right? But with some cases, we've seen that there's, a growing problem with people going to the masjid, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it also is because we are now living in a hyper, customization age, where people are used to having all of their experience customized in complete way, starting with smartphones to, nobody sits in front of TV and you wait till your favorite show comes, or you flip the channels until you find something that you find interesting watching. People just go, Netflix, Hulu, whatever it is, and get straight to and they binge and watch their show. And so I think part of it is that, religion offers only limited customization. It is geared toward community and toward, common denominator, if you will. And a lot of people in this customization age will find themselves left out, I think, because the experiences that they're going to get in the mosque are not going to be customized to their personal preferences, And a lot of times they'll say, well, it's not, so I'm not going to go, and so on. There's obviously so much more going on, like you just mentioned. I was just adding this another dimension as well. We do have another question. Merjan Popol is asking, how has muddled Orientalism impacted the world today with regard to Islam? For example, name brand companies like Shine continue to steal and rename the holy prayer mat and profit of it.
Yeah, so there's different kind of cases of this. There was something that happened during the past, like 2 months, where as the Palestinian cause became more visible on social media, and there were more kind of celebrities like the Hadid sisters and other celebrities saying that they were, that they were advocating for free Palestine, this kind of thing. There was actually, and I can't remember who it was, but it was like a couture European brand started to market Palestinian scarves, right? Their version for, I don't know, several thousands of dollars, right? Yeah. And so, we see these kinds of examples where corporations will, take, a product, right, that they think is going to be popular, right, with people that want to, demonstrate that they're allies to the Palestinians, right? Mm-hmm. But they'll make a luxury product. And that was that example. Now, in terms of a company making prayer mats, that's a little bit different, because if they're just making a prayer mat and it looks like a prayer mat, looks like a sajada, right? It's just like, they're just marketing to Muslims, right? They're just another company that is, creating a Muslim product. This is part of brand halal, right? Mm-hmm. And so that that's a little different than muddled Orientalism, because what muddled Orientalism is this combination of different religious symbols. So with a prayer mat, if it's just a Muslim prayer mat, right, that's used for salat, then that's pretty straightforward, right? And there's many choices on, in the marketplace. However, if you have something that's kind of combining the symbols, right, onto a t-shirt or something like that, then we are confusing the symbols. That's really more that what I would qualify as muddled Orientalism. But I think the other part of the question is, does muddled Orientalism, kind of affect, or is it damaging to, particular religious traditions? And I would say yes, because like if you were putting, there's examples in my book, like of putting an image of the face of the Buddha on, socks or something that you walk on the floor with or whatever, that would not be appropriate, like, right, from the Buddhist point of view, because you're like walking on the Buddha's face, right? And you're combining that with other symbols, and that, is very problematic. So it just kind of depends, because there is just marketing to religious people, right? Products like prayer mats. And then there's this kind of combination of symbols, right? Where the symbols are corrupted, or so there's something offensive. So in itself, a prayer mat's not offensive, right? To sell a prayer mat, but there are ways that religious imagery is offensive, such as the example I gave earlier of Rama appearing on bikinis, like, right? That's offensive.
And there was that example, I think, years ago, of something that resembled the word Allah in Arabic on Nike shoes, I think, and a lot of people complained about that.
Yeah.
But also, when you remember, when you mentioned the Palestinian, checkered head, scarf, keffiyeh, and I remember years ago when Rachel Ray, I think, she did a commercial for Dunkin' Donuts. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I think it was, and she was wearing keffiyeh just as a fashion statement. She probably didn't even know what it was, but there was an uproar about it, and this was also post 9/11 and whatnot.
Right.
And she basically had to apologize, and they had to take that commercial off TV. And that just tells you how times have changed, but also how much these symbols have become commodified too. As long as there's money to be made, it doesn't matter what it is. In the end. So great. And now we have a few more questions. Somebody said Louis Vuitton brand, I believe. All right, we have Sadia Sheikh. She said, thank you for these insights. Can you reflect on the ways in which New Age, in describing forms of contemporary Sufism, tends to be a way of delegitimation, and how that enables particular forms of policing?
Salam, Sadia. It's nice to get a question from her. So the question is, how does New Age kind of affect Sufism, and how does it result in forms of policing? I'm not quite sure I understand the second part, but let me take the first part first, and then maybe we can get a clarification on the second. So, New Age Sufism, depending on which kind of Sufi group it is, often characterizes Sufism or presents Sufism as a universalistic tradition, right, without kind of ties to Islam, right? And so one of the kind of problems with that, obviously, is that it erases Islam and then kind of recreates Sufism as something quite different. And I remember one experience I had many, many years ago. I was living in New Mexico. I think it was when I was living in Albuquerque. It was Santa Fe or Albuquerque. I'm pretty sure it's Albuquerque. And I saw this, there was like some kind of, not like an ad, but I heard about this group that was like a Rumi group. And so I thought it was going to be like serious kind of discussions of Rumi's poetry and, like kind of a religious thing. And I have these friends that live in Abiquiu who are Naqshbandiya. So I was like, oh, maybe it's, and I went up there for zikr all the time. So I thought, well, this is, something else that I can also do to kind of help my religious development. And I go to this house and it's just all these, all these people sitting around like drinking wine and, talking very casually about Rumi, right? And that was that, maybe that's kind of an example of like New Age Sufism. That's not really what Sufism is, right? Sufism is really hard work, and you have a teacher that, or, a group that kind of, there's practices that you do, there's particular rules that you have, and there's these kind of stations of, right, religious development that you have in Sufism. This wasn't it, right? This is so far removed, right? So that would be an example. Now, in terms of policing, maybe what Sadia is talking about, what referring to is maybe like the policing of like women, and like does New Age Sufism, I'm just guessing, I'm not sure, but does she mean do different forms of Sufism allow for more kind of freer, kind of movement in terms of, gender roles? I think there's actually some, fairly traditional, like religious Sufi, Sufi orders that allow, depending on the Sufi order, that allow for more of that. So there was one that I was kind of active in for a number of years, which is an Iranian or Persian order, and they had a center in Santa Fe, and the woman that led it, the person that led it was a woman, and it was like quite traditional, even though the person that led it was a woman. There wasn't a kind of segregation of gender during prayer. We would all sit with our backs kind of to the wall to pray together. So it's not necessarily that traditional is always polices gender. I mean, a lot of times it does, but there are exceptions. So I don't know if that was part of the policing question, because I wasn't clear, but that's something I could offer to.
Thank you for that answer. And I've just posted in the chat this link to a book. What you just mentioned about this community that you went to, Naqshbandiya, talking about Rumi, but in reality it's not. There was this book called Plant Trees, Carry Sheep, A Woman's Spiritual Journey Among the Sufis of Scotland, a memoir. This book was published in 2019, and just before the COVID, the author came to our local library in Virginia. I went to listen to the presentation. And basically, there is this community in Scotland that sort of call themselves a Sufi community. They're not Muslims, so it's but they try to live by many of the same principles as the Sufis. One person who was there was actually a Muslim, according to this woman, but most were not. And they do have a lot of symbols of that. They live in this like old Scottish house from, 18th century, and they have a farm, and they work on a farm, and they live off land and things like that, and they do call themselves Sufis, and they incorporate a lot of Sufi imagery and even vocabulary, but they're not Muslims, and they don't consider themselves followers of any religion. So it's very interesting. And I posted that in the chat, so anybody who wants to read that, I think it's a good example of many of the things that we're talking about here right now.
Right. And I think one of the questions that comes up with that is, as a religious scholar, one of the things I would be interested in asking them is like, why do you call yourself Sufi? Right. So like, what about Sufism is appealing? And why is that the naming that you choose? Because I think that's part of the appeal of, right, the East is like these kind of exotic, or what is perceived as exotic, or what is perceived as difference, right? This is a way to be different, right? I'm going to choose this identity, or I'm going to say that I'm doing this because it's a way to be, to engage in this kind of spiritual path. That's not the thing I grew up with, right? One of the things that we don't really talk about is that one of the things that's going on with this is that there is a distrust of authority. Like there's been this kind of historical distrust of authority among some individuals, especially in North America and Europe. And so the idea of the distrust or rejection of religious authority, that's one of the things that's appealing about the perceived, appeal of mysticism. In reality, we know that if you study mystical paths, there's a lot of authority, right? So there's some kind of teacher or guide, and oftentimes like the relationship can even be abusive, right? I mean, there's a lot of authority, but what the perception is among a lot of these kind of spiritual shoppers who say, I'm mystical or I'm a spiritual person, is that there isn't any authority. And so that's one of the appeals. And so they're like, well, I'm going to be in this group for a couple weeks, and then I'm going to go do this, I'm going to go do that. And there's kind of a lack of authority, right? In modern mysticism that's not really present, right? If you really look at, look at the Naqshbandiya and look at, who the leaders of that order have been. I mean, I have friends, like dear friends in New Mexico, they're Naqshbandis, and they would go to Cyprus like every year to see their teacher until he passed away, and so like authority is very important. It's very important to have a relationship with the teacher. Whereas with modern mysticism, there often isn't a teacher, it's just products, right? Products and therapies and vacations, kind of.
I like how you put it. Products, therapies, and vacation. That really is. All right, wonderful. So I think we're coming to an end of this. We I think went a little bit over time, maybe even, but that is fine. I know you have a little baby, so we took you away from that baby for a little too long.
She's napping. My husband put her back down for a nap, so she's okay.
Nice. Okay, very good. Well, if you don't mind, then Sadia was going to ask something else. How does legitimability? I don't know if that was. I'm not really quite sure. Maybe Sadia wanted to ask something but didn't fully type it. I don't know. But
is it in chat? Because I'm not seeing chat.
It is in chat. Yeah, it is in chat on YouTube.
So in my chat, it's just blank. I don't know why
I see. Well, the question just came in. It says, does meaningful hybridity work within the parameters of an Islamic Sufism in Western contexts? Does meaningful hybridity work within the parameters of an Islamic Sufism in Western contexts? That's the question.
I think what that's asking is it like doable to have a hybrid form of Sufism? Does it work? I mean, I don't know if it works. I mean, I don't know if, I think the question is like, does it work in terms of, in terms of the spiritual path, right? And that's probably a question to ask the people who are on the spiritual path.
Right.
I mean, theoretically, yes, it could work. So let me give an example. There's an example in the book, which might be a nice example for Sadia, whose work I love and I adore her. So I hope I'm answering this question in a way that's satisfactory. But there's an example in the book of essentially of a Sufi therapist who combined Sufism with therapy in a very kind of successful, respectful way. That might be a nice example of kind of Sufi hybridity, right? And that was a very successful example of, combining Sufism, and this the therapist was, Muslim, was a Persian Muslim, with, kind of psychoanalysis, right? Or psychiatric care, and it was a very successful, right? So I think that there's that example, which I document in my book. As with other examples, I'm not sure, but there's that one, and so I think that gives at least suggests that there is the possibility of success, right? But I think one of the things that kind of go back to is this idea of immediatism. Mm-hmm. Right. So with that example that's cited in my book, that's about kind of long-term therapy, right? Combining with, Sufism, and these kind of Sufi models of therapy. So that's something where, you're not going in to see your therapist like one or two times and then you're fixed,
Mhm.
right? This is like a long-term kind of thing. And so I think, maybe that's one way to think about this is, so if you have a hybrid form that, is long-term, that involves, work, then there's probably going to be advancement on that religious or spiritual path. But if the expectation is you're going to go in for a weekend and then you'll be fine by the end of the weekend, maybe it's not going to be successful. I mean, that is kind of what Zygmunt Bauman, writes about with liquid modernity, is that the reason that there's these endless products is that none of them are satisfactory, right? And so the way you get a kind of satisfactory product is by, in mysticism, is by longevity, is by like doing the work. And, we know as religious scholars that doing the work is hard. And I mean, we all know people who've been on the path for a really long time, and some of them have, advance on the path and some have not, at all. And it's like, did you just start this path yesterday, or have you been on the path a while? So we all know those individuals, right? Some in the academy, some out of the academy, right? And so, I think that's part of the answer. And one of kind of the things that I think is sad about all this to think about is that because of the way that these things are marketed as quick fixes, there's a lot of kind of what we would call unsatisfied consumers that then go on to the next product, and then they go on to the next product, and they probably aren't finding the kind of spiritual or religious kind of experience that they need, right? Because it's just this immediatism. Like, I'm going to go to Bali for a week to this resort, and I'm going to be better by the time I come back to New York. I'm going to do this meditation retreat in Santa Fe, right? Or in Taos, and then I'm going to be like a new person, kind of thing. And that's just not, as we know from studying religious traditions, it's also just studying kind of, other therapeutic models. We know that, it's work and it takes time, and it's not something that can be done immediately. Yet we have all these products. There's even, these CDs that people have made, right? That are like, 12 weeks of listening to a CD to do this, or like, here's a lot of this is also geared towards the corporate world, right? Where the corporations now have these, programs where, here's this, program that we recommend you do as our employee for the weekend in mindfulness, and that this will help your productivity. So the other thing about this is it's also just geared towards capitalism, right? A lot of stuff, especially the mindfulness stuff. It's like, if you do this stuff, you'll be a better worker, kind of thing. And so it's all kind of tied towards that. But I think, this question about, can these kind of new ways of thinking about mysticism be, helpful? I mean, they may be if they're really, taken seriously, and if they're really constructed in a way that does engage the tradition. But if they're these things where it's just, 48 hours or a week, and you're a new person, they're probably not going to be successful. And that's why Bauman, has this idea of liquid modernity and talks about the dissatisfaction with the marketplace. But that helps the marketplace, because then people just buy the next product.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. And one product that everyone should buy is this book, Buying Buddha, Selling Rumi. This was a fascinating conversation with Dr. Arjana. Thank you so much for joining us for CICW Book Talk. And thanks to our audience who joined us on different continents in different time zones. And we really appreciate that you found the time to be with us today. So all the best. Our next talk is on July 6th, Tuesday, July 6th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. It's by Dr. Joseph Kaminsky on his book, Islam, Liberalism, and Ontology, a Critical Re-Evaluation. Thank you so much, and all the best.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.